All right, so we'll try to talk about the beginning of the French Revolution today, starting with the Estates General. We referred to the Estates General already in class, and that was when the king, in early May 1789, decided to call representatives from each of the three estates together in order to kind of solve some of the problems that were going on in France. 300 representatives of the nobility showed up, 291 representatives of the clergy, and 610 representatives of the third estate. In previous estates generals, what had happened was the king would hear proposals, for instance, let's get rid of the game laws or let's tax all three estates. And then each estate would vote as one block. So the 300 nobility would vote and give one vote. Cumulative, the 291 clergy would vote and give one cumulative vote on the proposal. And the third estate, the 610 reps, would give one cumulative vote on the proposal. What happened early on in the Estates General of 1789 was that the third estate took a vow that they would not be involved in the Estates General unless the king allowed each representative to have one vote that counted. So overnight, by taking the tennis court oath and making the king agree to it, the third estate had 610 votes versus the cumulative 591 votes of the nobility and the clergy. So that was a dramatic change in how business was done, and it gave the third estate a lot more power when they started to make proposals at the Estates General. The Estates General turned into the National Assembly on June 17th. What had previously been the Estates General turned into an actual governmental agency on June 17th. So I'm not going to go too deeply into how this happened, but basically they went from hearing complaints and trying to figure out how they were going to solve them into becoming this National Assembly, which was governing France at the time. The transition that took place on June 17th was simply that the National Assembly was born, and this National Assembly was supposed to do two things, okay? They were, number one, supposed to run France, and number two, they were going to create a new constitution or a new governing system for France at the same time. 800, you'll see the numbers there up on the screen. 830 of the 1,201 original representatives at the Estates General stayed on in the National Assembly. So it was a smaller body of people, about 400 people, 371 people went home, and 830 people stayed at Versailles to continue to, number one, run the country, and number two, create a new constitution by which France was going to run in the future. I talked about the Lafayette's role at the Estates General, but this is kind of where the rubber meets the road with Lafayette. He was in charge of the army, and he basically said he was going to give the military backing to the National Assembly, which meant that because the military backed the National Assembly as the governing body of France, they sort of became the governing body of France. And like I said before, Lafayette was a pretty interesting character because he had one foot in the nobility. He was born a noble in a really well-connected family, and he had 16 names. But he also had one foot in democracy. He was connected to the American Revolution. His godfather, or his surrogate father, was George Washington. He backed the Americans against England, and he had his heart was in democracy. So he was kind of a moderate sort of guy. That was, one of the big leaders in the early part of the revolution. So Lafayette's backing of the National Assembly was a big deal because then they could proceed to change France in a more democratic sort of way. Now let's go to the headlines between July and August 1789. Things begin to move really, really quickly from July to August 1789. The first thing that happens is this thing called the Great Fear. And the Great Fear was when people heard the king was no longer officially in charge. They didn't really know who was governing France anymore. So without any government, or without people believing there was any government, big mobs of men started to kind of pillage the countryside, burning and stealing and marauding through the countryside. And it's kind of like we talked about several times in class. It's this idea that if people believe there is nothing in control of them anymore, then they'll kind of, act as though, they have complete free will to do whatever they want. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when given freedom, do some pretty nasty things. And the Great Fear is a big example of this. And it took a while for the National Army under Lafayette to kind of bring these people under control, who were kind of going around the countryside and taking advantage of the situation. You see this, over and over again in history. And, there was a lot of looting this previous summer in the United States when, people believed that, the police were either doing a bad job or not patrolling the city anymore. There's a whole group of people who just decided they were going to, take stuff. And, we can come up with many, many more examples, but, it kind of puts into context some of the stuff you saw in the news this summer. The next huge event was the Bastille. The Bastille was kind of an interesting place in the middle of Paris. The Bastille was a prison, and it was a prison that was kind of very old and ancient, kind of representation of what the king had done with people for years and years. So the Bastille went way back in the history of France, and the Bastille was a place where they put a lot of people who were held on letters de cachet. And as you remember, letters de cachet are when the king decides he wants to lock people up, he doesn't have to come up with any reason other than he decides to put them in prison. And the Bastille was the place where the king put his special prisoners. Most of them were political, so most of them were folks who the king believed, threatened him on some political level. And the Bastille got a reputation as the place where, the most kind of eloquent and, the most scary of the political prisoners of the empire were held. The other reason why the Bastille was really important was that it was the place where a lot of the gunpowder and weapons for France were stored. So it was an arsenal, essentially. And if the people could get inside the Bastille, they could take a lot of gunpowder, they could take a lot of weapons, they could take a lot of stuff that they might need if there was ever a revolt. So it was super important as an arsenal. And then the third thing is the Bastille was central in Paris. It was a big building right downtown Paris. And, if they could tear something down right in the middle of Paris, then they could, have their way with anything. So the Bastille, they still call it Bastille Day, the day of freedom in France. And it was, I think, July 14th, 1789. And the Bastille is important for those three things. Number one, it represented the crimes of the monarch with the letters de cachet. Number two, it had a lot of weapons and gunpowder that were useful to the revolutionaries. And then number three, it was a central big structure that, showed if the Bastille could be torn down, then anything could be torn down. And the thing about the Bastille is that, the bricks of it were used as kind of souvenirs of their newfound freedom. So this kind of anarchy and whatever that we look back on now is kind of considered the moment of freedom for France. Okay. Moving on, Artois and Condé flee. Artois and Condé were Louis XVI's brothers. And as you can imagine, when the brothers of the king flee, when the princes of France flee the country, they probably have a reason for doing that. Both of them fled to Austria, and both of them fled for a pretty significant reason. And that reason was that they believed that if there was a revolution, they wanted to have monarchs in waiting outside the country. So this is a pretty good indicator when the king's brothers, Artois and Conde, flee. This is a pretty good indication that the king believes that, maybe his life is in jeopardy. It wasn't at that moment in 1789, but obviously later on he gets killed, and his fears were justified. And these two guys sat it out over in Austria till the end of the war, or the end of the revolution, and never kind of came back to the throne. It was Napoleon who eventually got hold of it. The decrees of nobility. The decrees of nobility is very much kind of in the same vein as the National Assembly. The decrees of the nobility was one of the first pieces of legislation, so one of the first laws that the National Assembly dealt with. And the decrees of the nobility basically said that, well, what the National Assembly did with the decrees of nobility was they said that no longer would there be birthright of nobility in France. So that's a big deal. So this is basically wiping out the three-estate system with this one decree. And the king was kind of pushed into signing this. And as soon as he signed the decrees of nobility, then everybody in the country was now a citizen as opposed to a subject, right? Nobody was born within any rights to not pay taxes. Nobody was born any rights towards, other, benefits of the nobility. So this wiped out the whole three-estate system when the king signed the decree of nobility. So it was one of the very first pieces of law that was signed into effect. The second big piece of law that was signed into effect was the Declaration of Rights of Man. The Declaration of Rights of Man, like I said, is the most famous document that kind of comes from the French Revolution. It's very short. I'm going to give you guys a copy of it. It has 17 points to it, and many of them are rational and many of them are romantic. In it, the Declaration of Rights of Man is important because it lays out, the plan for the revolutionaries, but it's also important because you can kind of see the Enlightenment ideas kind of put in action. And the Declaration of Rights of Man is, one of the few things that has kind of remained as a hallmark of the revolution. And it's still kind of looked at as one of the most democratic documents ever produced by Western civilization and all that kind of stuff. And we'll go over that kind of bit by bit in class. And then finally, in the section from July to August 1789, the clubs form. And clubs are just political parties. So at the very onset of the French Revolution, political parties begin to form. And these political parties eventually come into conflict with one another, and it's a big story. Again, this is kind of complicated as far as the clubs forming, but then the clubs splintering off into, kind of sub-political parties and all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk through that as we kind of go along as well. And I think that is going to be my first screencastify, and we'll see how this plays out for you guys, but hopefully it'll work.